紹介預かりました松尾と申します。皆さんこんにちは。私たちは、今年6月1日から毎週一度、東京オリンピック・パラリンピック中止を求める女性たちで、オンラインデモを行っているメンバーです。今日は一緒に運動している、看護師や、教職員の方も同行者として一緒に来ています。これまで私たちは医療従事者、福祉関係者、教職員、アクティビスト、研究者、ジャーナリスト、障害者運動など多くの女性たちがそれぞれの現場から開催に抗議してきました。私たちの前にも多くの団体個人が日本政府東京都に中止を求めてきました。チェンジオルグの署名は皆さんご存知の通り45万筆以上も集まったのに、それを日本政府、東京都、IOC、JOC、そして日本の主要メディアは一切無視しています。先月6月23日にも全国各地と海外で中止を求める大規模なデモが行われたのに、それも無視しています。なぜオリパラ中止を求めるのかお話しします。そして、海外の選手、関係者、メディアの皆さんには来日をキャンセルしてほしいとお願いします。
Today we are here to tell you why we are calling for the cancellation of the Olympics, and also to call on all athletes from other countries, related persons and media personnel to please do not come to Japan. Please cancel your visit to Japan.
私たちが東京オリンピック・パラリンピック中止を強く求めるのは、現在日本社会で生きる女性たちの命と生活が危機にさらされているからです。
We strongly urge the cancellation of the Tokyo Olympics for the reason that the lives and livelihoods of women in Japan, in Japanese society, are now at risk.
日本政府は東京五輪の開催国であるにもかかわらず、コロナへの対策をほとんど行っていません。後ほど、こちらにいる医師たちも話しますけれども、検査数は世界最下位に近く、経済対策もなされていません。男女平等指数を表すグローバルジェンダーギャップ指数が日本は156カ国中120位で、女性の権利を認めていない社会です。女性たちが日常的に置かれている過酷な現実がコロナ禍で露骨に明らかになっています。
Despite the fact that it is the Olympic host country, the Japanese government has done very little to address COVID-19. The doctors will be speaking more about this afterwards, but the number of tests being conducted in Japan is close to the lowest in the world, and economic measures are barely in place. In the Global Gender Gap Index, Japan ranks out of 156 countries around the world, it ranks 120. And Japan is not a society that recognizes the rights of women. The harsh reality that women in Japan are subjected to on a daily basis has become blatantly evident through the COVID-19 pandemic.
女性たちがコロナ禍で在宅を強いられた結果、DV や望まない妊娠の相談件数が増加しています。
As a result of being forced to stay at home during COVID-19, and women also in this situation, domestic violence and unwanted pregnancies have increased.
10代の女性たちが公園やショッピングモールのトイレで子供を産み、死なせたために逮捕される事件が相次いでいます。
There has been, as a result, a number of continuing cases where teenage girls have been arrested for giving birth in parks or shopping mall toilets and letting the newborns die.
日本の非正規雇用の7割が女性ですが、コロナ禍で休業を余儀なくされた非正規雇用者の女性は5人に1人となっています。
5人に1人。はい。And in Japan, of those casual workers, those who are not subject to the various support measures, and so on, 70% of these are women. Of the employers, is 1 in 5 are.
給付金も満足に出されない状況で、職を失った途端に家を失う女性たちが増加しています。去年11月にはコロナで職を失いホームレスになった60代の非正規雇用女性が路上で男性に殴り殺されました。
As a result of having or being not eligible for state support or benefits, more and more women, as soon as they lose their jobs, are therefore also losing their homes, becoming homeless as well. In November last year, amidst the COVID pandemic, there was a case where a woman who was a casual worker in her 60s who lost her job was beaten and killed by a man on the street.
さらに 深刻なのは自死を選ぶ女性が増加していることです。
What is even more severe is the fact that the number of women who are taking their own lives is also increasing.
今年6月、女性の自死者は去年の6月に比べ 25% も増えました。
The number of women committing suicide in June of this year was 25% more than June of last year.
介護や育児など家族のケアを強いられている家族と暮らしている女性の自死が目立ち、すべての世代において女性の自死者が増えています。
Particularly women who are involved in care for family members who they are living together with are prominent in these numbers of suicide cases, and they're seeing an increase in the number of women committing suicide of all generations.
背景にはこの国のこの社会の貧困、暴力、差別、未来への希望が持てない現状があります。
And in the background of this is the situation of here in this society, the issues of poverty, discrimination, and so on, and people not being able to see a future.
後ほど医師からも話しますが、医療現場はずっと前からすでに崩壊しています。日本では入院すらできず、コロナが重症化して自宅で亡くなっている人が相次いでいます。
And we will hear more from the medical professionals who will be speaking today as well. However, the medical field here in Japan has already collapsed long ago. Here we are also experiencing the situation where people who have severe COVID-19 symptoms are unable to even be admitted to hospital and are passing away at home.
医療従事者の7割が女性であり、看護師の圧倒的多数は女性です。
70% of the medical and health workforce are women, and the overwhelming majority of nurses are also women.
医療崩壊のこの最中に東京オリンピック・パラリンピックのために看護師と看護学生が数百人規模で集められています。
And yet, even in such a time of medical collapse, there are hundreds of nurses and nursing students who are being recruited for the games.
もう一つどうしてもお伝えしたいのは、東京オリンパラ会場設営のために多くの野宿者たちが強制排除され、都営アパートに住む人々も追い出されました。
And one thing I would particularly like to emphasize is that since the time of the construction of the Olympic sites, many homeless people were forcibly removed from the places where they had been staying. And many people who were living in municipal flats have also been evicted from their homes.
都営アパートに暮らす多くの人、最後まで暮らしていた多くの人々は、行き場のない高齢女性たちでした。
And many of the people who were remaining in these government-owned flats until the end, until being forcibly evicted, were elderly women.
今お話ししたこれらはすべて、五輪開催のために私たちを犠牲にする国家からのフェミサイドです。
And these different cases for the purpose of the Olympics are a situation which is femicide by the state.
またコロナ禍にもかかわらず全国の小中高生や特別支援学校の生徒の競技観戦が授業の一環と位置づけられ、子どもたちがオリンピック開催観戦に、動員される予定でした。
And in addition, despite the COVID-19 pandemic, there were plans to mobilize students from elementary, junior, and senior high schools, as well as special needs schools, to watch the games as part of their schooling.
ようやく、緊急事態宣言下で、子どもの感染がなくなった都市もあるのですが、まだ動員が計画されている、県は残っています。
And even though finally, with the declaration of the state of emergency, the majority of cities have withdrawn their plan, there are still some places who are planning to go ahead with sending children to watch the games.
子どもの健康を無視した無謀な計画が遂行されて行われようとしている東京五輪が人命を第一に考えているとは到底考えられません。
Looking at these reckless plans to ignore the rights of children and send them to watch the games within these circumstances makes us question about whether these statements that the Olympics are being held with the human life as a priority really shows that this is not the case.
そもそも原発事故による汚染水をアンダーコントロールできていると前首相が発表したこと自体が嘘です。
In the first place, the government's announcement that the Fukushima disaster, including the contaminated water issue, was under control, in the first place, that was itself a lie.
原発事故後、被災地ではまだ仮設住宅住まいの人たちがおり、 放射能による健康も全く保障されていません。ここでも社会的に弱い立場の人たちが最も被害に遭っています。
Since the disaster, even today, there are still people living in temporary housing in the disaster-affected areas, and they are receiving no guarantee of their health impacts under the radiation. Again, we see that the most vulnerable people in society are the ones who are most affected.
コロナ禍における東京五輪の開催について専門家たちも再三懸念を示してきました。
Experts have repeatedly raised concerns about the possibility of the Tokyo Olympics being held in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic.
新たな変種株が東京オリパラで発生する可能性も否定できません。
And the possibility of a new strain of the virus occurring from the Tokyo Olympics cannot be ruled out.
五輪が終わった後にこの国に住む、女性たちに残されるのはそこからまた長く続くパンデミックです。
What Tokyo will be left with, what the women who are living in this country will be left with after the Olympics is the pandemic lasting an even longer time.
日本政府、東京都、IOC、JOC に私たちの声は届いていません。
Our voices are not being heard by the Japanese and Tokyo metropolitan governments or the IOC and JOC.
大切な命と引き換えになぜ私たちは東京五輪を選ばなければいけないのでしょうか。私たち日本の女性から世界の皆さんに強くお願いします。これ以上日本に来ないでください。
Why should we have to choose the Tokyo Olympics in exchange for precious lives? We, the women of Japan, urge the people of the world, please do not come to Japan.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much.
ご紹介ありがとうございます。公益社団法人日本女医会理事の青木正美と申します。
Thank you for the introduction. My name is Masami Aoki, the Executive Director of the Japan Medical Women's Association.
COVID-19、人類はかつてこれほど大きなパンデミックを経験したことがありません。
COVID-19 is a pandemic on a scale that humanity has never experienced before.
この1年半、私たち人類はそれぞれの立場で悪戦苦闘しながら COVID-19 と対峙してきました。COVID-19 は世界の人類に突然襲いかかってきた大災害です。
For the past year and a half, each one of us in our respective positions has been grappling with the challenges of COVID-19. This is an immense disaster that has suddenly struck humanity all over the world.
大災害の渦中にいるときに誰もその先の状況を正確に知ることができません。現在のパンデミックの状況はまさに先が読めない状況です。パンデミックはまだまだ全く終わる兆しが見えていません。
When you are in the midst of such a disaster, it is not possible for anyone to know accurately exactly what is going to happen. And in the midst of the current pandemic, this is exactly the situation. We cannot predict what will happen next. There is also no sign of the pandemic yet coming to an end.
こうしたパンデミックの時には多くの人を一箇所に集める大規模なイベントを絶対にやってはなりません。今更言うまでもないことですが、SARS-CoV-2 というウイルスは人から人へ移ります。
During such a pandemic, large-scale events that gather many people together in one place should not be held. Needless to say, the SARS-CoV-2 virus is passed from person to person.
オリンピックは世界中から選手を集めて行う世界最大のイベントです。
The Olympic Games are the biggest event in the world, bringing together athletes from around the globe.
会場をすべて無観客にしようがしまいが、選手や関係者が数万人も世界中から一箇所に集まるなど、パンデミック化に絶対にやってはならないことです。
Whether the venues are all closed to spectators or not, bringing together athletes and other related persons from around the world on the scale of tens of thousands of people should not be allowed to take place during a pandemic.
これは人類の生命維持に対する最大の冒涜です。
This is indeed the greatest affront to the sustaining of human life.
もしもこのままオリンピックを開けば、東京は巨大なエピセンターになってしまいます。
If the Olympics go ahead, Tokyo will become a huge epicenter of infection.
医療崩壊が起こり、多くの生命が失われることでしょう。そして 選手や関係者がウイルスを自分の国に持ち帰れば、世界中の多くの人々に大変な迷惑がかかり、それによって多くの人命が失われることでしょう。
The medical system would collapse and many lives would be lost. And if the athletes and other related people bring the virus back to their own countries, this would also cause great trouble for many people in countries all around the world, leading to the further loss of human life.
今、私たち人類がしなければならないことは、みんなで集まってスポーツをすることではありません。お互いできるだけ離れてパンデミックを収束させ、人類の命を守ることです。
What is now needed is not for us to get together and play sport. Rather, to stay away from each other as far as possible in order to bring an end to this pandemic and to save human lives.
私は臨床医ですから、東京がオリンピックによってどれほど苦しむことになるのか、より専門的に考えることができます。
As a clinical doctor, I am able to think as a professional about just how much Tokyo will suffer as a result of the Olympics.
しかし、世界中の皆さんもこれまでの1年半で自分の身の回りに起こったこと、あるいはメディアが伝えたニュースの数々を思い出せば、今オリンピックを開催するべきでないことがとても簡単に分かるはずです。
But also for other people around the world, if you look back upon what has happened around you in the past year and a half, and all of the news conveyed by the media, it should be very clear to see why the Olympics should not be held at this time.
これほど簡単なことが、なぜ IOC や日本の政府、東京都の優秀なリーダーたちが理解できないのか、私はとても不思議に思います。そして怒りを感じます。
I am simply perplexed at why such a simple thing is not understood by the IOC and the intelligent leaders of the Japanese and Tokyo metropolitan governments, and this makes me angry.
日本ではもともと PCR 検査が全く足りていません。誰でもどこでもいつでも何回でも無料で PCR 検査をできるようになっていません。
From the beginning, PCR testing in Japan was completely insufficient. Even today, there is no free access to PCR testing for anyone, anywhere, any number of times that they desire.
また、感染者用の病床を大きく増やすことが全くできていません。
It has also not been possible to have an increase in the number of hospital beds for infectious disease patients.
ワクチンを2回接種した人も 20% にも達していません。
Even now, the number of people who have received 2 doses of vaccination has not reached 20%.
また、イベルメキシンという日本製の有効な薬があるのですが、その治験も積極的に行ってもいません。
There is an effective drug made in Japan called ivermectin. However, active tests of this are also not being conducted.
日本はオリンピック開催国として最低限やるべきことを全くやっていません。
Japan is not even doing the bare minimum that it should be doing as the host country of the Olympic Games.
しかしそれには理由があると私は思っています。
However, I believe that there is a reason for this.
日本は幸運にもあまり多くの人が亡くなっていません。ですからパンデミックの本当の怖さを知らずにとても甘く考えているのだと思います。そして想像力も全くないリーダーは、オリンピック開催というありえない無謀な決断を下しました。
Japan is fortunate in that the number of people who have died is not so high. Therefore, I believe that the attitude is very complacent, not being aware of just how scary the pandemic truly is. And the leaders who completely lack any imagination have made the unthinkable and reckless decision to hold the Olympics.
ワクチン接種がかなり進んだ国でもデルタ株が再拡大して地球上のあらゆる国々でいまだにパンデミックは全く収まっていません。
Even in countries where the vaccination program is fairly advanced, Delta strain has re-emerged and the pandemic has not yet been contained in any country on the planet.
例えば、現在最も流行っているデルタ株は世界で103の、国で、その存在が確認されていますが、東京オリンピックには135の国と地域から選手が来ます。
For example, the now most prevalent Delta strain has been confirmed to be present in 103 countries around the world. Yet athletes are coming to Tokyo for the Olympics from 135 countries and regions.
単純に計算しても135マイナス103イコール32、32カ国の選手たちは東京で初めてデルタ株と出会います。
A simple calculation will show that 135 minus 103 equals 32. Therefore, this means that athletes from 32 countries will be encountering the Delta strain for the first time here in Tokyo.
晴海の選手村の宿泊施設は個室はありません。2人から6人部屋に選手は滞在します。食堂も3000人が一堂に食事をするなど、ソーシャルディスタンスも取れません。
There are no private rooms in the accommodation at the Harumi Athletes Village. Athletes will be staying in rooms of 2 to 6 people. It is also not possible to maintain social distance in the cafeteria where 3,000 people will be eating together.
ですから、選手村や競技場で新たな変異株が誕生する可能性も大いに考えられます。
It is therefore very possible that new strains of the virus will emerge either in the athletes' village or in the sports venues.
それらのウイルスが選手や関係者によってそれぞれの国に持ち帰られれば、さらにパンデミックは地球規模に広がってしまうことでしょう。
If such viruses are to be brought back by the athletes and others to their respective countries after the games, the pandemic could be spread even further across the globe.
すると、世界中の国々で医療崩壊が起こり、死者やロングコビッドも増えることになるでしょう。世界の経済の回復も遅れ、たくさんの人々の生活が追い詰められてしまうことになるでしょう。
This would lead to medical collapse in countries all over the world, as well as an increase in deaths and cases of long COVID. Global economic recovery would also be delayed, and many people's lives would be in difficulty.
こういうことを考えたとき、オリンピックは COVID-19 という人類最大の大災害の最中に最もやってはいけないこと、つまり人類のタブーであるのです。
When thinking about these facts, holding the Olympic Games in the middle of COVID-19, the biggest disaster in human history, is the absolute worst thing that could be done, a taboo for humanity.
ことに COVID-19 はあらゆる意味で弱い人を追い詰めていきます。女性や経済的に弱い立場の人々が最も先に犠牲になっていきます。
In particular, COVID-19 further marginalizes the vulnerable in every way. Women and those in economically weaker sections of the population are those to be sacrificed first.
こうしたことが十分に予想できるオリンピックを私たち日本人ばかりでなく世界中の人類は一致協力して止まなくてはならないと思います。
So such an Olympics where we can predict what is going to happen must be stopped by not only the Japanese people but in cooperation with people from around the world.
どうぞ東京オリンピックを止めて人類の命を守っていきましょう。今からでもまだ間に合います。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
Let us stop the Tokyo Olympics and protect human life. It is not yet too late. Thank you for your cooperation.
まず、私は2020東京オリンピック開催の中止を求めます。
Good afternoon, everybody. I am here to share that I am against the holding or calling for the cancellation of the 2020 Olympics.
昨年3月11日に WHO がコロナパンデミックを宣言してから16ヶ月が経過をいたしました。日本は十分な感染対策が取られておらず、今までもお話に出ましたけれども PCR 検査の数も不足しています。ワクチンの接種も十分ではなく、とても先進国とは言えない状況です。
It has now been 16 months since the WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic on March the 11th last year. Japan has inadequate contagion control measures. As mentioned, it still has insufficient numbers of PCR tests and insufficient vaccination, making it a difficult situation to call Japan an advanced country.
医療現場の話をさせていただきます。医療現場で働く人の7割以上が女性です。つまり COVID-19 による医療現場への負担は女性への負担でもあると言えます。
I would like to speak today about the reality of the medical field. More than 70% of people working in this field are women, which means that the burden of COVID-19 on the medical profession is a burden on women.
2020年10月の調査では、正規雇用看護職員の離職率が 20% を超えている病院が 21.2% で、前年度の2倍になっていました。
According to a study in October 2020, the proportion of hospitals which had over 20% of their fully employed nurses leaving the profession, leaving the job, was 21.2% of hospitals. This is a number twice that of the year before.
また、政府はテレワークを推進しようとしていますが、デジタル格差でテレワークの恩恵に預かれないエッセンシャルワーカーの8割は女性です。ごめんなさい、6割です。6割は女性です。
The government is also trying to promote telework. However, 60% of essential workers who cannot take advantage of telework due to the digital divide are women.
非正規雇用の6割が女性で、COVID-19 パンデミックで仕事を失い、十分な保障を受けられないのも女性です。
60% of casual workers are women, and it was women who lost their jobs in the COVID-19 pandemic, who therefore also lack adequate social welfare or guarantees.
女性の自殺率もこの1年で急増しており、特に若い女性の自殺は深刻です。
Suicide among women has also increased sharply in the past year, and this is particularly serious among young women.
COVID-19 の最前線に立たされ、影響を受けている多くは女性なのです。
It is women who are being placed on the front lines and being impacted by COVID-19.
感染対策と COVID-19 の患者の受け入れに多くの労力とコストが投入されていて、医療現場は疲弊が続いています。
Much effort and also money has been spent on contagion control measures and a system for admitting patients with COVID-19, which has left the medical profession exhausted.
これはオリンピック開催ありきで突き進んできた政府による人災です。これ以上 COVID-19 によって大切な命が失われることはあってはなりません。
This is a man-made disaster, which has been caused by a government driven by the desire to host the Olympic Games. No more precious lives can be lost to COVID-19.
2020年12月から日本は COVID-19 の第2波で急激に感染者が増加しました。入院病床が不足し、入院が必要な感染患者でも自宅療養をしなければなりませんでした。
Since December 2020, Japan has experienced a rapid increase in the number of cases of COVID-19 in this second wave. Due to a shortage of inpatient beds, even patients with COVID-19 who needed to be hospitalized had to be treated at home.
つまり、医療の崩壊によって必要な治療が受けられず、自宅で放置されることになったのです。その結果、自宅で病状が悪化して亡くなる方が増えました。
In other words, the collapse of the medical system meant that people were left at home without being able to receive the treatment that they needed. And as a result, we have seen that more and more people are dying at home as their condition worsens.
2020年3月から2021年2月10日までの1年間に病院以外で亡くなった方を検視したところ、261人が新型コロナウイルス陽性でした。
Autopsies conducted of people who died outside of hospitals in the year from March 2020 to February 10, 2021 showed that 261 people tested positive for COVID-19.
日本では PCR 検査も受けられず、診断されることなく亡くなっている方がたくさんいます。日本の医療体制は脆く、感染者が急に増えれば十分な対応ができません。
In Japan, many people have died without being diagnosed because they do not have access to PCR testing. The medical system in Japan is fragile and cannot cope adequately with a sudden increase in the number of infected people.
東京は今日から4回目の緊急事態宣言が発令されていますが、オリンピックが開催されて、さらに感染者が急増すれば、これまで以上に十分な医療が受けられずに亡くなる方が増えることは間違いありません。
From today, Tokyo is entering its fourth declared state of emergency. If the number of COVID-19 cases increases rapidly as a result of the Olympics, there is no doubt that more people will die from lack of access to adequate medical care than ever before.
日本の国民の命を、そして多くの女性を犠牲にしないために、オリンピックは中止にする必要があると思います。
I believe that the Olympic Games must be cancelled so that the lives of the Japanese people and of many women will not be sacrificed.
遅すぎるということはないと思います。ありがとうございました。
It is not too late. Thank you very much.
松尾様、青木様、そして、前田様、どうもありがとうございます。
しておりまして、非常にコロナでストレスがかかったナースの方から直接メールなどで声をいただく機会を得ております。
My name is Azusa Miyako. I am a nurse, but I'm mostly working in the psychiatric field. I'm not necessarily directly looking after COVID-19 patients. However, I am in a position where I am involved in various mental health programs for nurses. And through this, I can feel I receive many direct voices, emails, and so on from nurses who are experiencing severe stress as a result of dealing with COVID-19.
その中で大変私が深刻に思った生の声をいくつかご紹介します。
And I would like to share several of the very direct experiences, the real voices that I heard and thought were particularly serious.
一つはコロナ患者さんを受け入れるために本来の病棟業務が全くできなくなり、その方はがんの病棟、がんの患者さんを見る病棟なんですが、がん治療が行えないということについて非常に倫理的かつ患者さんへの申し訳なさを感じていたたまれないという悩みを一つ寄せてくださいました。
One example is a nurse who is working in ward for cancer patients. As a result of having to make adjustments within the hospital to increase beds for COVID patients and so on, this meant that the usual care or treatment to be provided to these cancer patients cannot be done. And this nurse is sharing about the fact that cancer treatment cannot be provided or is being delayed is something which she is feeling very a serious issue both ethically and also a sense of guilt or feeling sorry for the situation of the patients.
あと訪問もう先ほども話がありましたが入院ができない患者さんが家で重症化していく、あるいは軽症者用のホテルで重症化していくっていうことが実際起こっていて、入院したい、なんとかしてほしいっていう声を聞きながら結局それが調整できずどんどん悪化して入院した時には手遅れになっているというそういう患者さんをと関わる訪問看護師からもう悲鳴のようなメールが来ております。
And also there was the reference before to the number of people who are not able to be admitted to hospital, and from one nurse who is involved in visiting outpatients, talking about the fact who are either at home or are in hotels which are being kept for people with only light symptoms, for example. Nurses seeing the case that their patients are having more and more serious symptoms showing and are asking them to somehow find a place in a hospital, somehow allow them to be admitted to the hospital to do something, please. However, the nurses not being able to do anything about this and just seeing the patient's situation worsening, sometimes even to the point that it is too late, and receiving these very desperate calls from nurses in those positions.
すみません、あと最後に一つとても私が中でもとっても深刻だと思ったのがナースで患者さんにうつさないためにものすごく自分の生活を切り詰めてつまり家族からも離れてホテルに泊まって出勤したりですね、あともう何年もう本当にこのコロナが始まってから全く人と会わずに友達と会わずにリフレッシュが全くできないっていう状態のナースは本当にたくさんいるんですよね。でその方たちがなんて言うんでしょう、外食したり外を出歩いている人を見ると憎くなるっていうんですね。もう自分たちがこんなに我慢をしてるのに自粛ができない人たちのおかげで自分たちがひどい目に遭ってるというような、もう個人をどんどん恨んでいくような姿勢に心理状態になっていくというところが後々やっぱり対人援助をしていく上ですごく後を引くんじゃないかと とても心配しています。
では小学校に上がる前の就学前の子どもたちも連れて行く予定がありました。そのようなまだ幼い子どもたち100人から300人の子どもたちを公共交通機関を使って連れて行くことなど考えられません。しかも通勤時間にそのような子どもたちを連れてどうして連れて行くことができるでしょうか。私たちはそういう場合は必ず路線バスではありません、貸し切りバスを利用するのが当然なのです。
Even before the COVID situation, the original plan for taking children to this was including even taking children who have not yet entered elementary school, such small children, in groups of from 100 to 300 using public transport to attend the Olympic Games. This is something which for us as teachers is unthinkable. And particularly even looking at using this public transport during peak commuting hours as well. We called or said that this could only be done if there were chartered buses used for this purpose, but that was not the plan.
そして競技会場に入る前に子どもたちは手荷物検査をさせられます。検温もさせられる予定になっておりました。ということは、そして水筒の持ち込みも禁止されております。というのは異物混入の危険がある、テロの危険があるところだからだと思います。なぜ私たちの子どもたちをそのようなテロの危険にさらすような場所に連れて行かなければならないのでしょうか。考えられません。
Also, before entering any of the sporting venues, there would be bag checks and so on carried out even for the children as well. They are also planned to be prohibited from taking in their own water bottles. The reason being given for this is that there was the potential risks of terrorism and so on. However, we cannot understand how there could be a plan to take children to such a place where there might be a risk of any kind of terrorism taking place.
そして夏休み期間中でもあり、熱中症の配慮がもう必ず必要です。大人たちよりも体温調節機能の弱い子どもたちです。学校内で行う体育の授業でさえも気温と湿度を必ず見て熱中症の危険があったら中止にしておりますし、体育館も冷房を入れるなどの配慮をしております。競技会場は屋外である場合もあり、場合によっては座席によってはかなりの暑さを確保しておく必要があります。遮光板1枚が配られるということでしたが、熱中症の予防にも全くならない、不十分だと思います。
Also, these were to be taking place during the summer vacation. This is a time of the high risk of heat stroke as well. Children are not able to adjust their body temperature as much as adults are. So even in the venues, even in locations at school, we are, for example, always monitoring both the humidity and the temperatures and so on, cancelling sport or PE and so on when it is necessary if it is a dangerous situation, making sure there is air conditioning in gyms and so on. However, this kind of care is not possible to be taken in some of the Olympic sporting venues as well. Some of them are being held in outdoor, very, very hot locations, and even the different kind of measures which are being suggested were not sufficient in order to fully protect the children.
コロナに感染する子どもたちは少ないと言われておりましたが、変異株では子どもの感染も報告されています。子どもたちは昨年度から日常生活ではずっと感染予防をさせられて我慢を続けています。給食は前を向いて子ども同士しゃべることも禁じられています。運動会や学芸会、音楽会、宿泊学習、校外学習、遠足などさまざまな子どもたちが楽しみにしている行事がすべて縮小中止になっています。保護者の方たちも、子どもたちの参加に来ることも、制限されています。なぜオリンピックだけが特別扱いされるのでしょうか。
And well, it is said or it was thought that there are not many children who are susceptible to being infected with COVID-19. However, we are hearing of cases of children contracting the new variants of the virus. Since last year, the children have had to take all kinds of precautions against contagion when they're eating meals at school. They have to look forward and not talk with any of their classmates and so on. All of the different things which they are looking forward to, such as sports days, music events, camps, excursions and so on, have all been either reduced in scale or cancelled completely. Their guardians have not been able to visit the school for the usual observation days and so on. Why is it that all of these are being cancelled or reduced and only the Olympics are receiving this kind of special treatment?
野球観戦やサッカーの観戦などスポーツイベントに参加した方ならイメージが湧くと思いますが、子どもたちにはイメージが全く湧いていないんです。 近くで選手を見られるわけでもないですし、自分たちが見たいと思った競技を見られる保証もありません。なので子どもによっては逆にストレスをためてしまい、かなり我慢させられる時間になる可能性もあります。水を飲みながらおしゃべりをしてしまう子どもたちがいたっておかしくありません。コロナ変異株を持ち帰って地域や家庭に広げてしまうことは覚悟しておく必要があると思います。
And so for those people, adults who are used to going to, for example, baseball or soccer events, perhaps they have a kind of image of what these are, but for children that is not the case. Even going to the Olympics is not a situation where they can even see the athletes from close up. It's not even guaranteed that they would be going to see a sport that they have an interest in as well. This is meaning that it also increases or adds to further stress on children during this time when they are also, restraining themselves so much under the impacts of COVID in this past year as well. And there would, of course, also be the situation that there would be children who would be drinking water, who would be talking with their classmates and so on, which poses the risk of then bringing back new variants of the virus back home onto the areas in which they live as well.
数百人もの子どもたちを連れて行けば、真夏の暑さの中で気分が悪くなったり、熱を出したりする子どももいます。途中で歩けなくなってしまう子どももいるでしょう。熱中症もコロナ感染症も急を要する命に関わる症状だと思います。すぐに医療的なケアを受けていれば助かった命が助からないかもしれないんです。
If you are taking hundreds of children in a situation in the peak summer heat, there will of course be cases of some feeling ill, some developing a fever, some even not being able to walk as well. And the different impacts or the symptoms of both COVID and heat stroke and so on would mean that, or the impacts that COVID is having on the medical system means that even those who should be able to receive care are not necessarily able to.
子どもたちを無事に連れて帰ることができないかもしれないオリパラへの感染の動員はどう考えても無謀です。誰一人として犠牲になる子どもがいないように中止を要求します。
In the situation where it is not guaranteed to be possible to take the children and bring them back home safely again after the Olympics, taking them to such a situation is something which should not happen. Therefore, in order to ensure that not a single child is sacrificed in this way, we are calling for a complete cancellation.
児童生徒の動員が未だ計画されている自治体があることに驚きと怒りを感じています。その真の目的は何なのかと考えてしまいます。まだ間に合います。今はコロナ感染を封じ込めることに全力を尽くし、毎日ずっと我慢し続けている子どもたちに当たり前の日常生活を取り戻してください。子どもたちの発達や学習に必要不可欠な学習、公園や動物園などの校外学習に安全対策を十分にとって一緒に行ける日が早く来ることを真に願っております。ありがとうございました。
There are still some local governments who are maintaining their plans to mobilize children and take them to the games in this kind of way. I'm extremely shocked and angered at the fact that these plans are still existing. I have to question why and also have to say that it is not too late